In the chaos of World War II, where explosions shattered cities and armies surged across continents, victory was often determined not by firepower alone but by the unseen currents of communication flowing through the battlefield. Imagine a commander trying to coordinate an artillery strike on an enemy position while under fire, or a tank unit racing across the plains with no knowledge of reinforcements or enemy movements. Without a line of communication, without the ability to send and receive orders instantly, the most disciplined army could disintegrate into confusion within hours. And in this invisible struggle, the tools that carried messages, field telephones and radio networks, became the lifeblood of strategy, the hidden pulse that kept entire armies alive and coordinated. Field telephones, deceptively simple in appearance, were in fact a cornerstone of wartime command. Unlike radios, which could transmit signals through the air and risk interception, telephones relied on wired connections that provided security, clarity, and reliability. Soldiers in Signal Corps carried portable telephone sets, compact yet rugged, along with coils of wire long enough to stretch across forests, fields, and trenches. Every meter of wire represented a conduit for information, connecting forward observers to artillery batteries, headquarters to field units, and commanders to those executing the plan. Laying and maintaining these lines was perilous work. Engineers often dug trenches to protect wires or ran them along natural features to avoid detection, all while artillery shells exploded nearby and sniper fire threatened every movement. The slightest disruption, a severed wire, a damaged switchboard, could delay orders, misdirect troops, or leave soldiers exposed to deadly attacks. The significance of these telephones went beyond mere convenience. In the trenches of France, North Africa, and the Eastern Front, forward observers relied on wired telephones to direct artillery fire with precision. A single call could adjust the aim of heavy guns by mere meters, turning an ineffective bombardment into a decisive strike that neutralized enemy fortifications. Artillery officers often described these lines as the nerves of the army, capable of transmitting the collective judgment of commanders to the front lines instantaneously. Without them, decisions would have been left to runners or messengers, vulnerable to capture, delay, or death. The contrast was stark. Units with intact communication networks could move and strike cohesively, while those cut off descended into chaos. Yet telephones had limitations. Their reliance on physical wires meant mobility was constrained, and in fast-moving mechanized warfare, another technology was required. Radio networks provided the flexibility that field telephones could not. Using shortwave and long-wave frequencies, radios allowed messages to leap hundreds of miles instantly, connecting commanders to units in motion, from tanks rolling across the plains to reconnaissance teams scouting behind enemy lines. Operators had to be skilled technicians, mastering the art of tuning, transmitting, and receiving messages under pressure. Radios were also a battlefield in themselves, vulnerable to jamming, interference, and enemy interception. In response, encryption became essential. German units encoded messages with the infamous Enigma machine, producing ciphers that were extremely difficult to decode. Allied cryptographers, however, worked tirelessly at Bletchley Park and elsewhere to break these codes, turning intercepted communications into actionable intelligence that could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. The dual system of telephones and radios created a layered communication network that was both robust and flexible. Headquarters and static units relied on wired lines for high-volume, secure messaging, while mobile units depended on radio transmissions to coordinate maneuvers. In many operations, messages traveled along telephone lines to central hubs, were processed and encoded, and then broadcast via radio to forward units, ensuring that even units hundreds of miles apart could act in near-perfect synchrony. The coordination of combined arms assaults, infantry, artillery, armor, and air support depended entirely on this invisible web. The difference between a successful operation and a catastrophic failure often came down to whether a message could be delivered accurately and on time. Maintaining these networks required constant vigilance. Wires were vulnerable to artillery shells, tank tracks, sabotage, and weather conditions. Radios demanded batteries, spare parts, and careful calibration. In extreme cases, signal personnel worked under enemy fire to repair broken lines or establish new ones, improvising with trees, posts, or buildings to support cables, or constructing antennas to extend the reach of transmissions. Their labor was unglamorous, often overlooked in accounts of heroic battles, yet their impact was monumental. Without these networks, strategic decisions made at the highest levels could not translate into coordinated action on the ground. The psychological impact of reliable communication was equally significant. Commanders confident in their ability to transmit orders could act decisively, knowing that subordinates would execute instructions accurately. Troops reassured that artillery support, reinforcements, or evacuation instructions could reach them were more resilient under fire. Conversely, units that lost contact with headquarters often experienced panic, hesitation, and confusion, which could turn a minor skirmish into a disastrous rout. In many battles, the speed and reliability of communication determined morale, operational cohesion, and ultimately the outcome. The integration of telephones and radio networks transformed military doctrine itself. Armies were no longer tied solely to prep-land movements, they could adapt in real time. Reconnaissance reports could reach commanders who immediately issued new directives. Artillery and air units could be synchronized with advancing infantry, creating combined arms attacks that exploited weaknesses as they appeared. Even logistical planning benefited. Supply convoys could be redirected based on up-to-the-minute intelligence about front-line needs. Communication was not just a tool, it was a force multiplier, turning static resources into dynamic instruments of war. By the end of 1941, the strategic importance of communication was undeniable. The rapid, coordinated blitzkrieg advances in Poland, France, and North Africa showcased the advantages of integrated telephony and radio systems. The Allied forces, observing these successes, prioritized their own signal corps, investing in training, equipment, and operational planning to ensure that they could match or exceed the Axis powers' communication capabilities. Every major offensive relied on this infrastructure. Messages coursed along wires and waves, guiding movements, targeting artillery, and adjusting plans with unprecedented speed. Ultimately, field telephones and radio networks were far more than technological conveniences. They were the lifeblood of strategy, enabling armies to act as coherent entities rather than disjointed groups of soldiers. The men and women who built, maintained, and operated these systems ensured that orders reached their destination, that intelligence was transmitted and acted upon, and that units retained cohesion even under the most intense pressure. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, their work quietly shaped the outcomes of battles, campaigns, and the war itself. In the grand theater of World War II, where the roar of guns dominated the senses, the silent hum of wires and the invisible waves of radio signals proved to be among the most decisive instruments of victory. Wires, waves, and the mechanics of command. In the fog of war, information was more than power, it was survival. Commanders did not merely order troops to advance or hold, they needed precise, timely knowledge about enemy positions, terrain, and the readiness of their own forces. Field telephones and radio networks became the machinery that translated chaotic reality into actionable intelligence. While bullets and shells shaped the battlefield, it was the invisible flow of messages along wires and through the air that directed the dance of life and death. Field telephones, though mechanically simple, were marvels of wartime engineering. Designed for portability and durability, they could be disassembled and reassembled in minutes, carried by two soldiers along rugged terrain, and connected over miles of wire to form a network capable of linking headquarters with the most exposed units. The telephone line was more than metal, it was a lifeline. Soldiers learned to lay cables swiftly, often in adverse conditions, running them across forests, over rivers, and under roads. Every meter of wire brought risk. Enemy snipers, artillery fire, and environmental hazards threatened both the operators and the cables themselves. A single severed line could isolate a company or battery, leaving them unable to coordinate with reinforcements or call for fire support. In addition to laying lines, Signal Corps personnel mastered improvisation. When wires were destroyed, they used makeshift poles, trees, or even debris to elevate cables, ensuring continuity of communication. Soldiers learned to identify breaks, repair insulation, and reconnect circuits under extreme pressure. In winter, frost hardened wires and made handling them dangerous. In summer, heat could expand metal and loosen connections. Every obstacle required immediate solutions. The success of entire operations often rested on the ingenuity and resilience of these unsung engineers. Radio networks introduced a different dimension to wartime communication. Unlike fixed telephones, radios transmitted messages without physical connections, providing mobility that was essential for advancing units. Tank columns, reconnaissance patrols, and aircraft could maintain contact with headquarters over dozens, even hundreds, of miles. But mobility came at a cost. Radios required skilled operators who could tune frequencies accurately, avoid interference, and adjust for terrain obstacles that could distort signals. Each unit had its own frequency assignments to prevent overlap and reduce the risk of interception. Encryption devices added yet another layer of complexity. The Germans' Enigma machine and the Allies' cipher systems ensured that even if messages were intercepted, they remained unreadable to the enemy, creating a shadow war of code breaking and signal intelligence that unfolded alongside the physical battles. The integration of telephones and radios was an early example of a modern, multi-layered communication network. Headquarters could receive intelligence via telephone from front-line units, analyze it, and relay orders via radio to mobile forces. Conversely, reconnaissance teams could radio back critical updates to command centers, prompting artillery strikes or redirecting armored assaults. This constant feedback loop created an operational rhythm, a pulse of information that allowed forces to adapt in real time. In essence, armies were able to think across distances, responding faster than their enemies could anticipate. Reliability of these systems was never guaranteed. Telephone lines were frequently disrupted by artillery barrages, enemy infiltration, or even accidental damage from their own troops. Radios faced interference from atmospheric conditions, overlapping signals, and technical malfunctions. Maintenance was continuous, often requiring shifts of operators working around the clock to ensure connectivity. Batteries had to be charged or replaced, spare parts scavenged from damaged units, and antennas repositioned to optimize signal strength. In some cases, entire operations hinged on whether a single message could be transmitted or received within a critical window of time. The stakes were enormous, and the human effort behind the systems was immense. Signal intelligence became as critical as front-line combat. Listening stations monitored enemy transmissions, seeking patterns, intercepting messages, and attempting decryption. Skilled analysts could identify troop movements, estimate supply shortages, and anticipate offensives based solely on the timing and content of communications. A single intercepted radio call might reveal the location of an armored division days before it engaged in battle. The ability to act on such information often determined the difference between success and disaster. In effect, the battlefield extended beyond trenches and forests into the invisible space of signals, wires, and waves. The psychological impact of robust communications networks cannot be understated. Soldiers confident in their ability to contact support felt empowered, those cut off felt isolated and vulnerable. Field commanders trusted that their artillery could respond accurately to calls for fire and that reinforcements could reach units under pressure. The very presence of a working telephone line or radio gave troops a sense of control in an otherwise chaotic environment. Conversely, the absence of communication created anxiety, hesitation, and disorganization, often tipping the scales in favor of the adversary. One of the most remarkable aspects of wartime communications was the speed with which networks adapted to changing circumstances. Engineers and operators learned to construct temporary lines in newly captured territories, use mobile radio vehicles, and establish relay stations in adverse conditions. Whether bridging bombed-out cities, flooded riverbanks, or dense forests, communication units found ways to maintain connectivity, ensuring that commanders remained informed and troops coordinated. The ingenuity required to maintain these networks often rivaled the tactical skill of battlefield leaders themselves. Field telephones and radio networks also shaped logistics. Supply convoys relied on accurate communication to reroute around ambushes or damaged roads, ensuring that ammunition, fuel, and food reached front-line units. Coordinating multi-division movements depended entirely on the ability to transmit orders quickly and reliably. Delays or errors could halt offensives, leave units stranded, or cause shortages that compounded the chaos of combat. The efficiency of an army's communications system thus became a direct measure of its operational capability, linking information flow to tangible military outcomes. By mid-war, the strategic value of communication had been fully recognized. Both Axis and Allied powers dedicated significant resources to training signal personnel, developing advanced equipment, and creating redundant networks to prevent failure. The integration of field telephones and radio networks was no longer a technical consideration, it was central to the doctrine of modern warfare. Battles were planned with contingencies for disrupted lines, radios were assigned priority codes for critical messages, and cryptography became a battlefield in itself. Armies that mastered this domain could operate as cohesive, adaptive units, those that lagged risked disarray and defeat. Ultimately, the story of World War II's communication systems reveals that wars are fought not only with weapons but with information. Field telephones and radio networks transformed chaotic battlefields into coordinated theaters of action, allowing commanders to think, respond, and act across vast distances. The personnel who built, maintained, and operated these systems were as vital as the soldiers in the trenches, the tank crews on the plains, or the pilots in the sky. In the silent, tireless work of running wires, adjusting antennas, and decoding messages, the outcome of campaigns was often determined long before the first shot was fired. The battlefield in motion. War is fluid, unpredictable, and often violent beyond comprehension, yet it is also a story of movement, timing, and coordination. In World War II, where armored divisions could advance dozens of kilometers in a single day and air forces struck deep behind enemy lines, the ability to move forces effectively depended entirely on communication. Field telephones and radio networks became not just tools of strategy but instruments of mobility. Commanders orchestrated complex maneuvers, synchronized artillery, and managed supply lines across vast distances, all because information could travel quickly and reliably, even under the most adverse conditions. Consider the movements of armored units across Eastern Europe. Tanks, fuel trucks, and infantry trucks formed long, mobile columns that stretched for miles. Without radios, each vehicle would be isolated, acting only on preset orders or the judgment of its crew. Miscalculations could result in collisions, ambushes, or misaligned attacks. Radios allowed these columns to operate as a single, cohesive unit, with commanders transmitting instructions, receiving reports on enemy positions, and adjusting tactics in real time. Every tank commander with a functioning radio became a node in a living network, feeding and receiving information continuously. The advantage was clear: units could respond to changing circumstances instantaneously, turning mobility into a strategic weapon. Field telephones, meanwhile, retained critical importance even in mobile operations. Engineers constructed temporary lines along newly captured roads or improvised routes, allowing command posts to extend their reach deeper into occupied territory. These connections were often fragile, exposed to artillery, enemy sabotage, and environmental hazards, yet they provided unparalleled clarity for transmitting detailed, coordinated instructions. A well-laid line enabled precise artillery coordination, the timing of infantry movements, and synchronization with aerial reconnaissance. Even in the heat of battle, the phone line carried orders with accuracy, bridging the gap between planning and execution. The combination of telephones and radios also revolutionized reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. Scouts and forward observers could transmit observations instantly. A unit spotting an enemy supply convoy or fortification could immediately inform artillery units or air command, prompting rapid strikes that disrupted enemy logistics. Reconnaissance reports were no longer delayed by runners or courier units. Instead, they traveled along invisible networks of wires and radio waves, turning raw observations into actionable strategic decisions. Signal personnel trained to handle these tasks became an indispensable extension of the commander's eyes and ears, turning battlefield intelligence into a tangible, operational advantage. Mobility demanded more than just transmitting orders; it required coordination of support systems. Supply convoys, medical evacuation teams, and field engineers relied on accurate, up-to-date information to avoid delays and dangers. Radio networks allowed these support units to adjust routes on the fly, avoiding ambushes or destroyed roads. Field telephones provided secure channels for coordinating complex maneuvers, ensuring that the movement of troops, weapons, and supplies was orchestrated with precision. Without this network, even a well-planned offensive could falter, crippled by delays or miscommunications. The dangers faced by signal units were immense. Laying telephone lines often placed engineers directly in the line of fire. They were prime targets for artillery and snipers because severing communication lines could paralyze an entire division. Radio operators were equally exposed. Stationary radio sets could be triangulated by the enemy, making their locations vulnerable to artillery or air strikes. Yet despite these risks, these personnel worked tirelessly, knowing that every connection they maintained could decide the outcome of an engagement. Their courage was less visible than that of front-line soldiers, but no less critical. Signal intelligence evolved alongside these mobile operations. Intercepting enemy radio traffic provided commanders with strategic insights that could alter the trajectory of campaigns. Analysts would decode messages, track unit movements, and estimate supply levels, feeding vital intelligence back into the operational network. In a sense, every radio transmission was a dual-edged sword, a tool for one side's command and a potential source of information for the other. Armies developed intricate protocols, including frequency hopping and encryption, to minimize the risk of interception. This created a hidden battlefield of signals and codes, where operators and analysts engaged in a silent, relentless contest of wits. The psychological effect of constant, reliable communication extended to mobility itself. Troops could advance with confidence, knowing reinforcements, artillery support, or extraction orders would reach them. Commanders could take calculated risks, redirecting units quickly in response to changing battlefield conditions. This flexibility gave forces with superior communication a decisive advantage. They could strike where the enemy was weakest, withdraw before being encircled, and exploit opportunities in real time. Units without these advantages were slower to react, more prone to confusion, and often left exposed to enemy counterattacks. In addition, mobility amplified the complexity of logistics, which in turn heightened the importance of communication networks. Fuel, ammunition, and rations had to move in step with advancing units. Supply convoys had to navigate destroyed roads, enemy territory, and changing front lines. Medical evacuation units needed to locate casualties quickly and transport them safely to field hospitals. Without continuous, real-time communication, these vital operations risked breakdown, leaving soldiers vulnerable and undermining operational success. In essence, communication networks became the backbone of the Army's circulatory system, distributing not only information but also resources and care. The integration of field telephones and radios was particularly crucial in large-scale coordinated offensives. During multi-division operations, units separated by dozens of kilometers had to act as one. Orders traveled along telephones to intermediate command posts, then were broadcast by radio to mobile elements. Artillery, tanks, infantry, and air support were synchronized to hit the enemy simultaneously. This orchestration required not only technology but disciplined personnel who could maintain connections under stress, troubleshoot failures, and ensure messages reached their intended recipients. The success of these operations demonstrated how modern warfare depended as much on the flow of information as on the deployment of men and weapons. By the final years of the war, armies that mastered mobile communication dominated the battlefield. Units with reliable telephones and radio networks could maneuver quickly, adapt to enemy actions, and exploit weaknesses before the opponent could respond. In contrast, units with poor communication were often immobilized, forced to operate reactively, and frequently overwhelmed. Signal networks were no longer just a technical support function, they were strategic enablers, determining not only the speed of operations but the very outcome of battles. In conclusion, the evolution of field telephones and radio networks during World War II transformed warfare from static, linear engagements into a dynamic contest of speed, coordination, and adaptability. Mobility was no longer a matter of marching orders alone. It depended entirely on the seamless flow of information across distances, through wires, and over the airwaves. Signal personnel, engineers, and operators became the unsung architects of motion on the battlefield, ensuring that armies moved not blindly but with precision, responsiveness, and purpose. In the high-stakes environment of modern war, the ability to communicate while in motion was as decisive as the strength of any weapon, and the networks that carried those messages shaped the very outcome of history itself. Signals of victory and the legacy of communication. As World War II progressed into its final stages, the importance of communication networks became undeniable. Armies had learned that the fate of entire campaigns hinged not only on tanks, infantry, or air power but on the ability to coordinate movements, supply lines, and attacks with precision. Field telephones and radio networks, once considered auxiliary tools, were now the central arteries of military strategy, carrying information that determined life, death, and victory across vast theaters of war. The final offensives in Europe and the Pacific were as much a battle of signals as of arms, and their outcomes reflected which forces had mastered the art of communication. In the European theater, Allied forces planning the liberation of France relied on an intricate web of telephones and radios. From command headquarters in London and advanced field posts on the French coast, messages flowed continuously to synchronize landings, paratrooper drops, and naval bombardments. Engineers had laid hundreds of miles of telephone wire to connect temporary command posts, observation towers, and artillery batteries. Portable radios equipped with encryption allowed airborne units to remain in contact with Central Command despite being scattered across hostile territory. Every operation, from the initial landing on Normandy's beaches to inland advances, depended on these networks functioning flawlessly. Delays, miscommunications, or technical failures could have transformed carefully orchestrated plans into catastrophic chaos. Field telephones ensured that commanders in stationary positions maintained complete control over artillery barrages and defensive maneuvers. Even as troops advanced, lines were extended forward, connecting new observation posts and enabling accurate fire support. The reliability of wired communication meant that critical decisions such as when to call for reinforcements or when to press an attack were based on verified intelligence rather than guesswork. Meanwhile, radio transmissions allowed moving units to adapt to sudden changes in the battlefield, report enemy counterattacks, or request urgent supplies. The combination of these technologies ensured that units remained cohesive, flexible, and responsive, even in the most fluid combat scenarios. In the Pacific theater, where islands, jungles, and vast ocean distances complicated logistics, radio networks proved especially vital. Naval and amphibious operations required constant updates between fleets, ground troops, and air support. Island-hopping campaigns relied on rapid communication to adjust attack plans, coordinate bombardments, and manage supply drops. Radios allowed reconnaissance planes to relay information about enemy fortifications or troop movements, while field telephones connected forward beachheads to makeshift command centers inland. In many cases, the ability to communicate quickly across fragmented terrain determined whether a landing succeeded or failed. Signal units were forced to innovate continuously, erecting temporary antennas, using relay stations on high ground, and improvising wiring solutions in challenging environments. Beyond tactical operations, communication networks shaped strategic intelligence. Both Axis and Allied forces understood that intercepting enemy transmissions could provide decisive advantages. Cryptographers decoded messages, revealing troop movements, planned offensives, and logistical weaknesses. Entire campaigns were influenced by intelligence derived from intercepted communications, turning the invisible battlefield of signals into a game changer. The Allies' success in deciphering German codes, for example, allowed them to anticipate attacks, reroute convoys, and prepare defenses, effectively neutralizing enemy strategies before they could be executed. In essence, every radio transmission and every telephone call carried dual potential, operational efficiency for one side and exploitable intelligence for the other. Maintenance and adaptability remained constant challenges. Field telephones were vulnerable to environmental hazards and combat damage, requiring teams to repair or reroute lines under extreme pressure. Radios demanded power sources, replacement parts, and careful handling to remain operational. Signal units often operated at the front line, exposed to enemy fire and harsh weather. Their work demanded not only technical skill but also courage and resourcefulness. Despite being less visible than front-line combat, their efforts directly influenced the success of offensives, the survival of troops, and the ultimate outcome of the war. The psychological impact of these networks was profound. Soldiers who trusted that communication lines were operational could act with confidence, execute complex maneuvers, and respond to threats rapidly. Commanders could delegate authority effectively, knowing that orders would reach subordinate units without distortion or delay. Conversely, units isolated by broken lines or radio failures often became hesitant, disorganized, or ineffective, even if they were otherwise well equipped. The war demonstrated repeatedly that information flow was not merely an operational necessity, it was a determinant of morale, cohesion, and combat effectiveness. By the final months of the conflict, communication had become a defining feature of operational doctrine. Armies had evolved from static, linear formations to mobile, coordinated forces capable of acting across multiple theaters simultaneously. Field telephones anchored the command structure, while radio networks provided flexibility and rapid adaptability. Together, they enabled armies to strike quickly, exploit weaknesses, and maintain logistical support across complex battlefields. This integration exemplified the emergence of modern warfare, where victory depended as much on the control and dissemination of information as on brute force. The legacy of these communication networks extended far beyond the war itself. Lessons learned in the deployment, encryption, maintenance, and integration of field telephones and radios laid the groundwork for post-war military doctrine and technological innovation. Armies recognized that secure, reliable, and adaptable communication was a strategic asset, essential for planning, executing, and sustaining operations. Post-war militaries developed advanced signal corps, sophisticated encryption devices, and integrated command systems, directly inspired by the successes and failures of World War II. The technological and organizational principles established during the conflict continue to influence military communication to this day. In retrospect, field telephones and radio networks were more than tools, they were enablers of strategy, survival, and victory. Their effectiveness determined the speed, precision, and coordination of operations across continents and oceans. They allowed commanders to act decisively, troops to maneuver effectively, and intelligence to be exploited with unprecedented efficiency. The men and women who built, maintained, and operated these systems often labored under extreme danger, their contributions overshadowed by the spectacle of battle, yet their impact was undeniable. Without them, coordinated offensives like the liberation of France or the island-hopping campaigns in the Pacific may have faltered or failed entirely. Ultimately, World War II demonstrated that in modern conflict, victory depends not solely on weapons or manpower but on the mastery of communication. Field telephones and radio networks transformed chaos into coordination, uncertainty into decisive action, and dispersed units into cohesive forces. The invisible threads of wire and waves carried the decisions, intelligence, and commands that shaped the course of history. As the war concluded and armies returned home, the lessons of these networks endured,